Imagine playing a game of blindfold chess. Your opponent makes a move, but they don't tell you which piece moved or where. Now, you must figure out the correct move or face checkmate. This is, in many ways, what happened to the pilots of Flight JP-1308, where poor communication and cognitive biases put them in a perilous situation, where the wrong move would have dire consequences. Stay tuned. In 1980, a relatively obscure airline, Inex-Adrià Airways, made a strategic move by ordering 3 brand-new MD-81s, an updated version of McDonnell Douglas's DC-9. Inex was a small player in the Yugoslav aviation scene, with Adria Airways acting as the flag carrier for Slovenia, even after the country's independence. Adria's old DC-9 fleet was aging, and these MD-81s seemed like the logical upgrade. They required minimal retraining for the pilots, as the MD-81 was similar enough to the DC-9, and the added capacity gave the airline a competitive edge in the busy holiday market. In the fall of 1981, Inex partnered with a Slovenian travel agency, Compass, to arrange a special one-day return trip for 130 passengers from the Slovenian capital of Ljubljana to the French Mediterranean island of Corsica. The plan was to offer a day of sightseeing on the island before flying back in the evening. Initially, Inex had planned to use one of their older DC-9s for the flight, but after receiving the new MD-81 aircraft, they decided to swap in the larger, more comfortable jet and fill the extra seats with employees and their families. On December 2, 1981, the crew and passengers gathered early in the morning at Ljubljana Airport. They boarded the 5-month-old MD-81, which had accumulated only 683 flight hours by this time. The crew consisted of 2 pilots, 4 cabin crew, and a mechanic who was accompanying them for potential technical support. The captain, a 55-year-old former Yugoslav Air Force pilot, had over 12,000 total flight hours. Of those, only 188 hours were spent on the MD-81, but he had over 9,000 hours flying the very similar DC-9, so he was no stranger to this type of aircraft. The first officer, 40 years old, had 4,200 total hours, with 288 on the MD-81. He had learned to fly at a local flying club and then joined Inex in 1980. By this point, he had only recently transitioned to flying the MD-81, but had gained praise for his performance in the DC-9. The pilots were both skilled and experienced, but as we'll soon see, flight hours and technical skill would not be the determining factors in this tragedy. The boarding process was chaotic, as they were overbooked by a large margin. While the aircraft had seats for 130 passengers, they were boarding 173, including several children who were seated 2 to a seat. One of these children was actually the first officer's own son, who was seated in the cockpit on the second jump seat. This was completely legal at the time, but certainly unconventional. Despite exceeding the seating capacity, the weight and balance of the aircraft were not problematic, since it was a day trip with no baggage. Most passengers were children, so there was little concern about the aircraft's load. After addressing a minor electrical issue, the crew completed their pre-flight checks, and at 06:37 UTC, the aircraft took off from Ljubljana, operating as Flight JP-1308 to Ajaccio, Corsica. Now, before we dive into the flight itself, let's take a moment to understand the challenges awaiting them at their destination. Corsica's Ajaccio Airport was not your typical international hub. The island is mountainous, with sharp elevations that rise dramatically out of the Mediterranean. This topography can create turbulent flying conditions, especially with strong winds and rapidly changing weather. Ajaccio's airport had only one active runway, 0321, and while runway 03 was equipped with an instrument landing system, ILS, runway 21 lacked such support due to the mountainous terrain in the approach area. In typical conditions, landing on runway 21 required a visual approach after following the ILS for runway 03 to a circular minimum. This made it a challenging and complex operation. On top of that, the airport's air traffic control tower was not equipped with radar. Pilots often had to rely on visual guidance and careful coordination. Due to these operational challenges, the International Federation of Airline Pilots Associations, IFALPA, had issued a cautionary advisory to pilots flying into Ajaccio, urging extra vigilance when approaching the airport. Now, whether the crew of Flight JP-1308 was fully aware of these operational difficulties is unclear. This was, after all, the first time Inex had operated a flight into Ajaccio. As we will see in the next part of the story, the combination of unexpected challenges, communication lapses, and cognitive biases would soon put this flight in grave danger. Now, let's talk about something critically important. As pilots, when we fly to a new or less well-known airport, particularly one with limited services like Ajaccio, it's absolutely essential to thoroughly research the airport's procedures and facilities before the flight. This ensures that we understand exactly what we're getting into and are properly prepared for the maneuvers we might need to perform. Typically, the airline's planning department will provide a special brief for the pilots, outlining the procedures. But if that's not done well, there's always a wealth of approach charts, low-level flight maps, and documentation that we can access to prepare ourselves. This is a fundamental part of a pilot's duties. Ideally, nothing about the descent, approach, or landing procedures should come as a surprise when the flight is underway. Unfortunately, in this case, the voice recorder only captured the last 30 minutes of the flight, meaning the pre-flight briefing was lost. However, there's reason to believe that the crew wasn't as well prepared as they should have been. We'll explore why shortly. When we talk about preparation, I can't help but share something personal. Many of you know that I've recently moved with my family to a new country. The stresses of setting up a new life, launching a new business, and still being there for my loved ones has been incredibly challenging. Many of us face these types of pressures from time to time, and I truly believe in finding tools that help make these situations easier. One tool I've found invaluable is BetterHelp. Through their platform, my therapist has offered excellent advice on managing stress and maximizing my productivity while keeping a healthy mindset. BetterHelp is an online platform that makes it easy to connect with a licensed therapist. You simply sign up, fill out a short questionnaire, and within 48 hours, you're matched with a therapist. From there, you can communicate via phone, messaging, or even video calls, which makes it incredibly flexible. I view therapy as a form of exercise for the mind, and I believe everyone can benefit from it. If you're interested, I encourage you to visit betterhelp.com/mentorpilot for a 10% discount on your first month. Thank you to BetterHelp for making a real difference in my life. Now, let's get back to the flight. The climb and cruise phases of the flight were relatively uneventful. The aircraft soared through calm weather, passing overhead Italy. But in the cockpit, things were far from quiet. In addition to the routine communications with air traffic control, the cockpit door was open, and the cockpit voice recorder, CVR, picked up several passengers asking the pilots technical questions about the airplane. As they got closer to their destination, the pilots received weather reports including indications of a tailwind for runway 03. Since runway 03 was the only one equipped with an ILS, instrument landing system, the pilots began considering the possibility of needing to circle around and land on runway 21, the non-ILS runway. A circling maneuver is considerably more complicated than a standard straight-in landing, requiring the aircraft to descend to a relatively low altitude before breaking off to the left or right to land visually from the opposite direction. This maneuver requires excellent crew coordination and strict adherence to procedures. Ideally, the pilot flying should have briefed the approach in detail before starting the descent, including the required speed, minimum altitudes, and navigation aids. Unfortunately, this didn't happen. At 08:31 local time, Flight 1308 received clearance from the Rome sector to begin its descent from flight level 330. As the descent began, the captain asked the first officer to calculate the landing data. Once that was completed, The first officer began his approach briefing. However, the briefing should have been completed before the descent started to minimize any disruptions during the increasingly demanding phase of the flight. This is especially important when the approach is unfamiliar or complex, as was the case here. Though the weather conditions were reported as clear over the airport, Corsica's interior mountains were already shrouded in dense fog, which would soon create significant challenges for the crew. What should have been a simple descent and landing was about to become a much more complicated and hazardous operation. The combination of distractions, incomplete briefings, and an unfamiliar approach would soon contribute to a tragic outcome. As the crew continued to prepare for the landing, they were operating with limited information, and the risks were stacking up. At this point, the approach they were about to execute was becoming increasingly complex, and the pilots were entering an unfamiliar and challenging procedure. Let me take you through the entire instrument approach they were about to fly, because understanding the details will soon become crucial. The approach procedure for runway 03 at Ajaccio began from a VOR beacon called Alpha Juliet Oscar, AJO, located 10 nautical miles south of the airport. A VOR, VHF omnidirectional range, beacon is a basic navigational aid that sends out signals, allowing aircraft to determine their magnetic bearing from the beacon. To put it simply, if you were flying directly away from the VOR on a 300-degree track, you'd be following the 300-degree outbound radial from the beacon. The pilots would then be able to track inbound along the same radial to reach the VOR again. From the VOR, the procedure called for the aircraft to enter a left-hand racetrack-shaped holding pattern in order to lose altitude. Once they had lost enough altitude, they were to proceed on the 247-degree radial outbound for 8 nautical miles. At this point, they would perform a left-hand course reversal, looping back more than 180 degrees to intercept the ILS, Instrument Landing System, localizer, and glide slope, which would guide them down toward runway 03. If needed, this would then be followed by a visual circling approach to land on runway 21, which required the pilots to visually identify the runway after circling to line up for landing. This was already a relatively complicated approach. Most ILS approaches are more straightforward, but this one involved a series of intricate steps. To fully appreciate the complexity, we also need to look at the minimum altitudes and speeds associated with each phase of this procedure. Due to the mountainous terrain around the airport, the minimum altitude over the AJO VOR was set to 6,800 feet. This was the lowest altitude at which the aircraft could descend in the holding pattern. After leaving the VOR and heading out on the 247-degree radial, the aircraft could descend to 3,300 feet, but the descent had to be controlled and precise. Once the localizer and glide slope were captured, the aircraft could descend further at the minimum descent altitude, MDA. Now let's revisit the holding pattern for a moment, because it's going to be critical for understanding what went wrong. Holding patterns are designed with specific altitudes that ensure a safe distance between the aircraft and any terrain within a defined area around the pattern. This area is referred to as the protected area. The size of this area is based on the maximum allowed speed an aircraft can fly while in the holding pattern, typically at a speed of 210 knots for such procedures. This speed ensures that the protected area extends far enough to clear mountains like Mount San Pietro, which is 4,500 feet high. That's why the minimum safe altitude in the holding pattern had been set to 6,800 feet. However, the approach chart that the pilots were using did not show the full size of the protected area. Instead, it depicted a holding pattern for an aircraft flying at 150 knots, a speed much slower than the maximum allowed. At 150 knots, the protected area would not extend far enough to clear Mount San Pietro, which was located just off the edge of the chart. The highest terrain near the racetrack was only around 2,500 feet, which made it difficult to appreciate the danger of descending below the minimum altitude of 6,800 feet. Since the mountain was nearly off the edge of the chart, the pilots may not have fully grasped how hazardous it would be to descend lower than the charts indicated minimum altitude. Back on board flight JP-1308, the pilots began discussing the speeds they would use during the approach. But, just as they were getting into the details, they were interrupted by a flight attendant asking to adjust the cabin temperature, and then by the first officer's son, who was seated in the cockpit. These distractions continued as they prepared for the critical stages of the flight. After this, the crew engaged in a lengthy exchange with the air traffic controller, who cleared them to descend to flight level 110. The conversation was a bit strained, with the captain expressing dissatisfaction about the controller's use of phraseology, something that would soon take on an ironic tone, as we'll see. Once the communication with the controller was finished, the pilots resumed their approach briefing. They discussed the courses they would follow, the altitude for intercepting the ILS, the decision height, the missed approach procedure, and other minor details. But once again, the first officer's son interrupted, asking whether they were going down yet, and later pointing out a mountain he thought resembled the Matterhorn. These distractions, combined with the already complex nature of the approach, were beginning to weigh on the crew. In aviation, precision is everything, especially when dealing with such intricate procedures. Each interruption and lapse in focus made it harder for the pilots to stay sharp for the critical stages ahead. As we'll see, these distractions, coupled with their lack of preparation, would play a significant role in what happened next. These interruptions in the cockpit, while not ideal, serve as a reminder of why it's generally not advisable to allow non-operating personnel into the cockpit during critical phases of flight. However, back in the days when this practice was more common, I, too, often had friends and family sit in the jump seat. It only took a simple briefing to ensure they remained quiet during these key moments. In hindsight, I do miss those days. But on Flight 1308, the cockpit voice recorder, CVR, had poor quality, and this affected the clarity of several key moments in the briefing. There were two crucial pieces of information that were not heard on the recording: the minimum altitude of 6,800 feet during the holding pattern and the maximum holding speed of 210 knots. It's unclear why these items weren't discussed. Perhaps the good weather lulled the crew into a false sense of security. But this is an important takeaway. Briefing and verifying these kinds of restrictions are critical, particularly when flying in areas with high terrain. The pilots continued their preparations by tuning the navigational radios to receive the ILS and setting up the radio altimeters. The captain then reported their position to the approach controller, noting that they were 28 miles from the VOR at 11,000 feet. Despite this, some parts of the approach briefing continued to be interrupted by unintelligible comments from the first officer's son, all while they remained at 11,000 feet. At 8:40, the aircraft was handed over to the Ajaccio approach controller, marking the point where the flight began to take a significant turn for the worse. This is where we need to introduce a new key player in this story: the approach controller. The controller was a 24-year-old who had been working at Ajaccio Airport since July 1980. However, he had only been qualified for the approach control position for less than a month at this time, and there was no supervisor on duty. The only other person in the control room was an assistant controller with only 1 year of experience, whose primary role was answering the phone. When the captain called to report their position and request descent, the controller responded, "IC approach, good morning. Number 1 in approach. Maintain flight level 110 until you reach Alpha Juliet Oscar VOR. It'll be for an approach from the VORQ. 1009 QFE. Surface wind 280 degrees at 20 knots. Runway 21 in use. Report over Alpha Juliet Oscar VOR, and then descending over Alpha Juliet Oscar VOR." Now, let's break down this transmission because this moment was pivotal in the unfolding events. The first part of the message was clear. The aircraft was to continue level flight until reaching the VOR. But then, the controller said, "It'll be for a procedure from the VOR." This phrase is crucial and we need to understand its implications. When a controller says, "Cleared for approach," it means the pilot can proceed with the approach procedure as laid out on the approach chart, from the initial fix all the way down to the point where the tower will clear them for landing. In this case, it would have made sense for the controller to clear Flight 1308 for the approach, as they were the only aircraft in the vicinity, and no other traffic was an issue. But the controller didn't use the phrase, "cleared for approach." Instead, he said, "It'll be for a procedure from the VOR, which, in my experience, doesn't convey the same meaning." "It'll be for a procedure" suggests that the controller was simply letting the pilots know that they would be cleared for the approach at a later point, but they had not yet been cleared. This subtle difference in wording would have been misinterpreted by the pilots, who likely believed that they still needed to request permission for further descent. They understood that they were not yet cleared to continue with the approach and would need to wait for specific clearance. This miscommunication is where things began to unravel. The controller believed that Flight 1308 was free to descend at their discretion, but the pilots thought they still needed clearance. This misunderstanding led to the next crucial issue. The lesson here is about the importance of clear communication, particularly in aviation. Misinterpretation over radio is a real danger. When humans interact, much of our communication is nonverbal, through body language, facial expressions, tone of voice, and other cues. But over radio, especially when the individuals cannot see each other and are speaking in a language neither is a native speaker of, the potential for misinterpretation increases dramatically. This is why aviation communication has such strict protocols. It's not just about speaking in English. It's about using clear, specific terminology that leaves no room for doubt. Unfortunately, this miscommunication was a critical turning point in the flight, leading to the events that followed. Today, aviation relies on a highly controlled set of standardized terms and phrases, defined by the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, to ensure clear and precise communication between pilots and air traffic controllers worldwide. These terms are used to minimize the risk of misinterpretation, especially in critical situations. However, back in 1981, ICAO had not yet published its first universal phraseology handbook, and as a result, pilots and controllers from different countries often had different interpretations of what certain terms meant. What we're about to see is a prime example of why that phraseology handbook was eventually written, and why it's so important for every pilot and controller to adhere to standardized communication practices as closely as possible. As the captain of Flight 1308 heard the controller's slightly confusing transmission, he replied with his own interpretation. "Roger, sir. That means we are maintaining 110 until the Ajaccio VOR in the holding pattern. We don't need to descend at the moment. Maintaining 110. Runway 21 in use. Wind is from 180 at 20 knots. QNH 1009. In his readback, the captain correctly acknowledged the runway and the altimeter setting, and stated they would continue maintaining flight level 110 until reaching the VOR. However, he also mistakenly read back that they would need to descend in the holding pattern. This hinted that the captain expected further clearance to do so, which should have alerted the controller that the flight was not ready to start the approach. Yet, the controller simply confirmed the captain's readback, without offering any further clarification about the clearance. As far as the controller was concerned, the flight had already been cleared for the approach, and they were free to descend, as per the published procedure. A minute later, at 0849, Flight 1308 reached the VOR, and the captain reported, "Just now at the Ajaccio VOR, level 110 in holding pattern." The captain's message reflected his understanding of the procedure. The aircraft was now in the holding pattern, and they were awaiting further descent clearance. But the controller, believing that the flight had already been cleared to descend, responded with, "Roger, 1308. Report leaving Alpha Juliet, Oscar on radial 247 for final approach." The controller thought the flight was simply providing a routine position report. Without radar at the airport, this report was essential for the controller to know where the aircraft was. However, this wasn't the message the captain was expecting to hear. The captain replied, "Okay, we are just over the Ajaccio and are requesting further descent." This was when a second, more significant misunderstanding occurred. The controller was confused as to why the flight was requesting further descent when, in his mind, they had already been cleared for the approach. He likely began to make assumptions about the crew's intentions, based on what he had observed in previous flights. In his experience, most pilots approaching Ajaccio didn't bother with the holding pattern. Instead, they would steeply descend on the 247-degree radial outbound from the VOR to quickly reach the ILS intercept altitude, bypassing the holding pattern entirely. This was a local procedure used by pilots familiar with the airport, but it wasn't part of the official approach chart. This was the first time the crew of Flight 1308 had flown into Ajaccio, and they were unaware of this local procedure. From the controller's perspective, the crew's transmission, reporting over the VOR and requesting descent, sounded like the standard sequence for a flight, skipping the holding pattern and heading directly out on the 247-degree radial. The controller, perhaps influenced by expectation bias, began to deprioritize the contrary evidence that had been provided by the pilots, including the clear mention of the holding pattern. This is an important point. Expectation bias can be incredibly dangerous. The controller, assuming the flight would follow the common procedure, didn't seek further confirmation about the crew's intentions. In aviation, it's absolutely essential to confirm and clarify when there's any doubt about another party's intentions. If the controller had simply asked, "Are you intending to skip the holding pattern?" the misunderstanding would have been resolved immediately. But instead, in an effort to help the pilots move forward, the controller responded with, 1308, cleared to descend to flight level 90 and proceed direct to VOR. This clearance, given in the context of the ongoing misunderstanding, set the stage for the next phase of the flight, but it was also another step away from the safety and clarity that should have been ensured by a properly executed approach procedure. This situation shows how critical it is to maintain clear and precise communication, especially when assumptions about procedures or expectations start to cloud judgment. In aviation, even the slightest misunderstanding can have catastrophic consequences, and this was a perfect example of that risk. The controller's transmission to Flight 1308 at Airweight 51 was intended to clear them for further descent, but due to poor transmission quality, it sounded like he said 3,000 feet instead of 3,300 feet. His intention was to allow the crew to descend to the minimum altitude for the outbound radial 247 from the Ajaccio VOR, which they were supposed to report leaving. However, the pilots interpreted this as clearance to descend to 3,000 feet in the holding pattern, as they had expected. The controller had used the words "on radial 247, which theoretically should have indicated the descent would occur on that radial, but it's likely that the pilots didn't interpret it that way. In fact, according to the final report, previous instances had shown that crews from Yugoslavia had sometimes interpreted such clearances to mean they should descend to the specified altitude before entering the radial segment, which was incorrect and had occasionally led to violations of minimum altitude. The issue here was compounded by a few key factors. Firstly, the minimum altitude in the holding pattern was 6,800 feet, a fact the pilots had failed to review during their approach briefing. Secondly, many Yugoslavian pilots reported that their air traffic controllers were accustomed to taking terrain clearance into account when giving clearances, even in the absence of radar guidance. This was a significant difference from the procedures in France, where the pilot, not the controller, is responsible for ensuring safe terrain clearance in non-radar environments. Moreover, the Jeppesen charts depicting the holding pattern showed a racetrack pattern over relatively low terrain, with a maximum height of only 2,500 feet, a misleading visual depiction as the protected area actually extended over a much higher 4,500-foot mountain. All these factors combined to convince the flight crew that they had been cleared to descend to 3,000 feet in the holding pattern. And they believed this descent would be completely safe. The captain, confident in their understanding, then read back, "Roger, will do. We're leaving 110 for 3,000. Radial 247 out of 110. He also asked the controller to repeat the altimeter setting, which the controller did without further comment. To the controller, this transmission sounded clear. Flight 1308 was descending to 3,000 feet on the 247 radial as he had intended. However, the captain's phrasing was ambiguous, and it wasn't entirely clear whether radial 247 referred to the current or future position of the aircraft. The ambiguity didn't stop there. The first officer made a comment, possibly pointing out the confusion in the captain's transmission. The captain, realizing his message wasn't entirely clear, quickly clarified, "We are holding over IAO. We'll call you inbound on radial 247. This should have been a clear indication to the controller that Flight 1308 was actually entering the holding pattern, as there was no other logical interpretation of that statement. But by now, the controller had mentally placed Flight 1308 on the 247 radial. His brain had already assumed the aircraft was descending on that radial, so when the captain's clarification came through, it didn't register. The controller simply replied, "Roger, Parpur." At this point, the aircraft entered the holding pattern. Now, to understand what happened next, we need to look at the aircraft's configuration for descent. When the pilots finally received their descent clearance, they engaged the autopilot's vertical speed mode. In this mode, the autopilot controls the aircraft's pitch to maintain the selected descent rate. The crew set the vertical speed to 2,200 feet per minute, a rate that would have resulted in the aircraft reaching 3,000 feet just before crossing the 247 radial. It's unclear whether this descent rate was intentional or a mere coincidence. The final report doesn't explicitly clarify whether the crew had set a target airspeed or whether the throttle was set to idle for the entire descent. What we do know is that the engines were set to idle from the start of the descent, which may have had an impact on the aircraft's performance during this critical phase. The combination of this ambiguous clearance, misunderstandings, and the autopilot's descent settings created a dangerous situation that would soon escalate. With each misstep in communication and decision-making, the pilots were inadvertently setting the aircraft on a course toward disaster, one that could have been avoided with clearer communication and a more precise understanding of the approach procedure. Even with the engines at idle, the aircraft was in a clean configuration, meaning no flaps or speed brakes were deployed, which resulted in a high descent rate of 2,200 feet per minute. This rate caused the aircraft to cross the Ajaccio VUR, at an airspeed of 285 knots, which briefly dropped to 224 knots, but then increased to 256 knots again. This was slightly above the normal 250-knot speed limit, below 10,000 feet, and well above the 210-knot speed limit for the holding pattern. The pilots had not reviewed this speed restriction during their briefing, adding another layer of danger to an already precarious situation. To make matters worse, as the aircraft flew outbound from the VOR, it encountered a tailwind, later calculated to be around 65 knots, which significantly increased the aircraft's ground speed. While the holding pattern's protected area was large enough to account for typical speed errors, Flight 1308 was pushing these boundaries. Their high speed caused them to fly a wider and longer pattern than usual. The pilots were unaware that this speed put them on course to fly directly over Mount San Pietro, that 4,500-foot-high mountain at the edge of their charts, while they were actively descending toward 3,000 feet. At this critical moment, they still had 2 minutes to avert disaster as they began the outbound leg of the holding pattern. The first officer started timing for the 1-minute outbound leg, as required by the procedure. As the descent continued, The captain extended the flaps and slats to start slowing the aircraft down. Despite the rising tension, the pilots didn't appear to be concerned. The cockpit voice recorder captured some unintelligible conversations, and once again, the first officer's son asked something in the cockpit, but there was no sign that the crew felt uneasy. As they continued outbound, they suddenly left the clear coastal conditions and entered a dense cloud layer, which was covering Corsica's mountainous interior. This marked the start of the escalating danger as the flight proceeded deeper into the mountains. Shortly after entering the clouds, the aircraft reached the end of their outbound leg timing and began a left turn back toward the VOR. This is when the captain seemed to sense something was wrong. At 08:52:15, the captain made a call to air traffic control stating, "We're rolling inbound out of 6,000. This wasn't a routine position report, as pilots don't normally need to tell air traffic control when they're turning inbound." To me, this suggests that the captain wanted to ensure the controller understood exactly where they were and what they were doing. However, in France, the standard terminology for this type of position report would be turning inbound, but the Yugoslavian captain said rolling inbound, which the controller didn't fully understand. The controller responded, "Roger, 1308, report turning inbound." Realizing the confusion, the captain responded, "Turning inbound to IAO because at the moment we are in cloud." This response only added to the confusion. When the captain said, "turning inbound to IAO," it could have meant either the Ajaccio VOR, Alpha Juliet Oscar, or Ajaccio Airport itself. Since the controller thought the flight had already passed the VOR, he assumed that turning inbound meant they were now on final approach, preparing to intercept the ILS for landing. The controller didn't realize that Flight 1308 was still in the holding pattern and descending well below the minimum altitude. The controller responded with, "Roger, 1308, Charlie Tango, report on final. Surface wind 280 degrees, 20 knots. Charlie Tango was another navigational aid situated on final approach, where the controller would typically hand the aircraft off to the tower for landing clearance. Naturally, the flight crew found this instruction confusing. They hadn't even reported leaving the hold, let alone entering the 247 radial. The cockpit voice recorder picked up some conversations as the pilots tried to figure out where Charlie Tango was located, and they didn't immediately respond to the controller's message. Flight 1308 was now in a left turn with a bank angle of 25 degrees, encountering increasingly heavy turbulence. The turbulence, likely caused by strong winds interacting with the mountains, caused significant fluctuations in airspeed and vertical acceleration. This was a direct result of flying in the lee of the mountains, where downdrafts from the turbulent air were pushing the aircraft downward. This type of turbulence, caused by the wind passing over mountain ranges, can be severe. When flying near mountains, especially in windy conditions, aircraft can encounter powerful downdrafts that can push an aircraft dangerously low toward the terrain below. These downdrafts are called rotors, and they're some of the most dangerous weather phenomena pilots can encounter in mountainous regions. This is precisely why the minimum altitude in the holding pattern had been set to 6,800 feet, a full 2,300 feet above the highest mountain in the area. But as Flight 1308 continued its descent, the aircraft was dangerously close to the terrain, with no time to recover from the unexpected turbulence. The pilots had descended far below the safe altitude, and the dangers were now compounded by the mountainous terrain and severe weather. The situation was spiraling toward a catastrophic outcome, with very few opportunities left to avert disaster. As the crew of Flight 1308 continued their descent, the greatest danger had already become apparent. The terrain. The aircraft was now on a collision course with Mount San Piero, and the Terrain Proximity Warning System, GPWS, was the first to sound the alarm. At 08:53:08, the system activated, urgently calling out, "Terrain, terrain, terrain." This sudden burst of noise combined with the controller's radio transmission regarding the circuit direction for runway 21, was incredibly disorienting for the flight crew. The two warnings overlapped, causing a moment of confusion and panic as the pilots struggled to comprehend the situation. The crew had several seconds to process the situation, grappling with the overwhelming oral inputs and trying to understand why the GPWS warning was suddenly sounding. Had they made a mistake? And if so, what was it? After a few more seconds of uncertainty, the GPWS warning changed to "pull up," and the first officer, following the alarm, began slowly adding power and raising the nose. However, despite these actions, the vertical descent rate remained unchanged. The aircraft continued its downward trajectory as if nothing had been done to reverse it. This was because Flight 1308 had entered the direct shadow of Mount San Piero, and the aircraft was now being pulled down by a powerful downdraft with a vertical speed of 2,300 feet per minute. In this situation, the pilots needed to apply maximum power and aggressively pitch up to overcome the downdraft and initiate a climb. Unfortunately, that wasn't happening. As the GPWS warning continued, the captain saw they were still descending and called out to power, pushing the throttles to full forward. But it was too late. At or rate 5321, the aircraft collided with Mount San Piero while still in a left bank, with the left wingtip striking several boulders protruding from the mountain's ridge. The impact was so powerful that it overturned a boulder measuring 8 cubic meters, and the damage to the wing severed half of it, rendering the aircraft uncontrollable. For 7 more seconds, the plane continued to fly over the summit while rolling rapidly to the left before colliding with a rock outcropping, located approximately 700 meters below the summit. This final impact destroyed the aircraft completely, scattering wreckage over an area of half a square kilometer. Tragically, all 180 people on board were instantly killed. At the exact moment of the accident, the air traffic controller, who had been communicating with the flight, heard a strange whistling sound on the radio. When he tried to contact Flight 1308 again, there was no response. A search and rescue mission was launched immediately. About 5 hours after the crash, the wreckage was found in a steep ravine on the side of Mount San Piero. The crash site was so difficult to access that much of the wreckage was left at the scene for over 25 years. Investigators faced significant challenges in finding usable evidence. However, thanks to the discovery of the black boxes, a detailed investigation by the French authorities revealed that the primary cause of the accident was the pilot's descent below the minimum altitude in the holding pattern, which led to the collision with the terrain. While the French investigation was clear in its findings, Yugoslavian investigators felt the cause was overly simplistic. In an appendix to the final report, the Yugoslavian team highlighted a misunderstanding between the pilots and the controller, which led the pilots to believe that descending to 3,000 feet was safe. This misunderstanding stemmed from the use of non-standard terminology by both the controller and the pilots, which contributed to the confusion and ultimately the tragedy. Further input from various aviation groups also raised concerns about the location of the holding pattern, suggesting that it should have been placed over flat terrain rather than over the mountainous region. The consensus led to changes in the approach procedure, and today, the holding pattern for Ajaccio is located away from the mountains, making the approach much safer. The crash also led to Ajaccio Airport being equipped with radar, a significant safety improvement. Looking back, it's clear that several modern procedures, including standardized terminology, could have prevented this tragedy. Had the controller used the phrase "cleared for approach" during the initial contact, the misunderstanding could have been avoided, and the entire chain of errors might have been averted. There's another heartbreaking fact that modern pilots are trained to handle: terrain escape maneuvers. In today's training, pilots are drilled to immediately apply maximum thrust, level the wings, retract speed brakes, and pitch up to 20 degrees, and even more if necessary, upon hearing a GPWS hard warning. Had the pilots of Flight 1308 been trained in this maneuver, they may have been able to overcome the downdraft and clear the mountain. Tragically, though, the aircraft almost cleared the mountaintop, merely striking a boulder with its left wing, just a few feet higher. If the aircraft had been just a few feet higher, everyone on board could have survived. This tragedy, like many others in aviation history, helped to shape the safety improvements we see today. The lessons learned from incidents like this have contributed to aviation's incredible safety record in the modern era. As we reflect on this and other similar tragedies, we also realize that progress often comes at a great cost. The changes made in response to these accidents have saved countless lives, and it's important to recognize the advancements in aviation safety that have come as a result of this painful history. If you want to discuss this incident further, or explore other aviation events, I invite you to join my Patreon crew, where I regularly host Zoom Hangouts to discuss these topics and more. I'd love to connect with you there. Thank you for reading, and I hope you have a fantastic day wherever you are. Until next time.